With tensions skyrocketing in Ukraine, a confrontation between the United States and Russia is more likely than ever. But what would that look like, and how do these two military heavyweights compare? If Russia and the US come to blows, anyone caught in their way better make sure not to get underfoot of these two military titans. The US remains the world's premier military superpower, but Russia holds fast to the number 2 spot, just barely edging out over China's rising star. In Russia, crippling sanctions over the annexation of Crimea have bled Russia dry for almost a decade and been an absolute economic disaster for the nation. Not only is the Russian economy critically weakened, but sanctions and stagnation have led to a slow but steady brain drain of Russian talent out of the country. Russian professionals, entrepreneurs, academics, and artists are all migrating out of the country and seeking better opportunities in Europe or the US. The lack of a diversified economy is a crippling vulnerability for Russia, and the global fall in oil prices has only made economic woes even worse for the nation. This has directly translated into a sharp decline in military capabilities, as budgets shrink and planned replacements for aging equipment fail to materialize. Slowly but surely, the gap in technological capabilities between Russia and the US is growing. The United States has its own financial woes, seeing the worst inflation it's seen in 40 years. With interest rate hikes coming in 2022, the American economy is sure to feel the pinch as investors tighten their purse strings. However, the American economy remains strong and well-diversified, leaving it far less vulnerable to economic disruption than Russia, whether that disruption comes from social change, technology, or war. But what do the numbers say about a possible war between the two heavyweights? Population matters in a prolonged war. Without population, there are no reinforcements, and an economy is far more vulnerable to mass conscription and casualties. The United States has a population of 334,998,000 versus Russia's 142,321,000, giving the US over a 2-to-1 advantage in population. However, that's only part of the story, because Russia's aging population only makes its disadvantages even worse in comparison to the US. The US has approximately 147,399,000 conscripts potentially available to fight a brutal multi-year conflict, while Russia only has 69,737,000. Of those potential conscripts, though, approximately 122,274,000 are fit for combat duty in the US, while in Russia only 46,681,000 potential recruits are fit for combat. Every year, 4.4 million American youth reach military age, but Russia's population crisis sees only 1.3 million youth reach military age. Both nations are experiencing a decline in birth rates, with the US birth rate at 1.70 and Russia's at 1.50. This is below the 2.1 birth rate required to sustain a population, but the United States continues a positive population growth thanks to healthy amounts of immigration. Russia, on the other hand, is experiencing a population decline. In simple terms, if the two powers engage in a mass casualty conflict that spans multiple years, Russia will be bled dry long before the US is. A modern war, however, will likely be too fast and brutal for population trends to determine a winner, even if it doesn't turn nuclear. That's why what might matter most is the number of personnel both countries can muster within months of hostilities starting. The United States enters a potential conflict with a military of 1.39 million strong, while Russia maintains an active duty force of 850,000. The difference is staggering, with the US military almost twice as big as the Russian military, giving the US an immediate numerical advantage. Another advantage the US enjoys is a professional all-volunteer fighting force, while Russia has had to cancel plans to transition to an all-volunteer force due to economic woes and shrinking budgets. However, Russia has come a long way from when its military was staffed primarily by conscripts, and today only about 30% of the Russian military is conscripted, or about 225,000. The disadvantage is still significant, though. A professional all-volunteer military is more likely to retain highly trained individuals who over time transition into senior leadership positions. This fills the upper echelons of an all-volunteer force with seasoned veterans who make all the difference in combat operations. A conscripted military, however, struggles greatly to retain individuals over the long term, leading to veterancy issues and a lack of well-tested command corps. There's no direct way to measure the advantage of an all-volunteer military versus a partially conscripted one, but throughout history, volunteer soldiers routinely outperform conscripted soldiers, which is what made mercenaries so attractive to world powers throughout most of human history. The United States thus enjoys another advantage over Russia, though that advantage has shrunk due to Russia's growing professional military. A critical component of any army, though, is the strength of its reserve force, especially in modern high-intensity warfare that can see regular forces quickly rendered combat ineffective. The United States maintains a significant reservist force of 442,000 personnel versus Russia's 250,000. In terms of reservists, the U.S. enjoys both an advantage in numbers and training. American reservists receive regular training and even partake in combat deployments, making their competency comparable to many nations' regular forces. This is not an accident, but rather by design. The United States keenly understands that in a modern high-intensity conflict, it will face significant initial losses and is prepared to mitigate this loss in capabilities via a strong reserve force. By comparison, Russian reservist training has been historically spotty at best. Efforts to retain veteran soldiers with reservist contracts hopes to counteract a critical lack of training, but at the moment the Russian reserves simply pale in comparison to American reserves and capabilities. A lack of training also extends to the Russian regular forces as well. Though great leaps have been made to increase the readiness of combat troops, large exercises, however, are not cheap and can produce a great deal of wear and tear on equipment, something that is a critical concern for a Russian army fielding aging equipment and with a limited budget. Thus, while the Russian forces have undergone an increase in military drills in the last decade, they still fail to match the training tempo of their American counterparts. The Russian air forces have also seen a dramatic reduction in training, with most pilots flying only between 100 and 120 hours per year. The United States was matching this rate until 2019, when it pushed for an increase to an average of 200 hours per year. Aging military aircraft in both militaries is directly leading to skyrocketing maintenance expenses, and flight hours are threatened with further reduction for both militaries. Big buys of F-35 and 4.5 generation F-15 and F-18s by the U.S., though, seeks to replace its aging fleet, which has an average age of 28 years. Russia, on the other hand, is procuring jets at a much slower rate. The U.S. spends $770 billion on its military, while Russia spends $154 billion. While adjusted for purchasing power parity, though, the Russian defense budget is closer to $170 billion, given that Russia buys much of its equipment from its native defense contractors. The U.S. still retains a massive advantage, but not as large as one might think, given that salaries and benefits are much more expensive for the U.S. than for Russia. Still, in sheer value, the United States purse is exponentially deeper than the Russian war purse, leading to a much greater proliferation of hardware. In the air, the United States fields a fleet of 13,247 aircraft, over 3 times as large as Russia's air fleet of 4,173. America's fighter fleet is over twice as large as Russia's, with 1,957 fighter aircraft versus Russia's 772. Both U.S. and Russia have nearly the same number of attack aircraft, with 783 versus 739, though this is only because the United States prefers multi-role aircraft over dedicated attack platforms. A significant technological advantage in munitions allows even non-attack aircraft in the U.S. fleet to effectively carry out air-to-sea or air-to-ground strike missions, while Russia struggles with a lack of smart weapons and support platforms for said weapons. This disparity in numbers and capabilities means that the United States Air Force and Navy aren't just better positioned to secure air supremacy, but to exploit it with devastating fire support missions against Russian ground targets. Though American air supremacy will still have to contend with one of the world's best air defense forces, knowing that it can't match America in the skies, Russia has historically put a lot of weight behind ground-based air defenses, creating some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. It's assumed then that Russian ground forces will operate under the cover of their ground-based air defense assets, seriously threatening the survival of American attack platforms. However, due to a need to operate under this umbrella of safety, Russian ground forces would be unable to rapidly maneuver, potentially leaving the decisive advantage of momentum in the U.S. hands. In a defensive mode, however, Russian ground forces would be incredibly difficult for the U.S. to break if it was denied its air power by robust air defenses. Mobility is incredibly important in modern warfare, and here the U.S. shines with the largest air and sea mobility fleet in the world. The U.S. operates 982 transport aircraft versus Russia's 445, giving it a decisive advantage in quickly maneuvering troops and equipment in theater. The U.S.'s focus on a large mobility fleet, though, is a matter of necessity. Just like the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans both make the United States invulnerable to invasion by any power on Earth, it is just as a big barrier for American troops needing to get to the front. As Russia lacks any capability whatsoever to threaten the U.S. with a land invasion, a conflict between the two would be indubitably playing out in Eastern Europe, necessitating the rapid movement of troops and supplies from America to Europe. Once in theater, though, the American air mobility fleet will make it an agile force capable of quickly exploiting opportunities, which can just as quickly replenish losses. One area of air power where the U.S. absolutely dominates Russia or any other world power, though, is in the number of special mission aircraft. These highly specialized platforms are critical for the success of a modern combined arms military and run the gamut from airborne early warning to maritime patrol aircraft to electronic warfare platforms. These aircraft can be everything from eyes in the sky to specialized platforms that listen in on or jam enemy communications and are critical for modern high-tech warfare. Here, the United States fields a whopping 774 special mission platforms versus Russia's 132, putting the logistical, intelligence, and technological advantage firmly on the U.S. side. Attack helicopters are absolutely critical for supporting any ground offensive, and the U.S. operates 366 more of these platforms than Russia, with 910 versus 544. Russia operates 3 main attack helicopters, the Kamov Ka-50 Black Shark, the Mi-24 Hind, and the Mil Mi-28. The U.S. operates the AH-64 Apache and the AH-6M Little Bird. With a focus on special operations, the AH-6M Little Bird provides an extremely agile air support asset for soldiers in dense urban areas, while the U.S. Army's Apache is designed to destroy enemy armor and provide direct fire support for American infantry. The Russian attack helicopter fleet represents the shifting of priorities and ideologies between its years as the Soviet Union and its modern life as the Russian Federation. The Hind is a heavy fire support platform with the capacity to ferry up to 8 fully equipped troops into combat, while the Ka-50 and the Mi-28 represent a more traditional attack helicopter design. Tanks make up the backbone of any modern army, and here both nations shine. The United States has a tank force of 6,612 platforms versus Russia's 12,420. It appears that Russia enjoys a 2-to-1 advantage over the US in the tank arena, but the truth is that Russia inflates the size of its armored forces by counting units kept in storage as part of its active force. In reality, Russia operates closer to 3,000 tanks, with 9,000 mothballed and in reserve. Not only would these tanks require weeks for them and their crews to be prepared for combat, but most are Cold War relics with extremely questionable survivability on a modern battlefield. As Stalin once put it though, quantity is a quality all its own. Though Stalin never lived to see the blistering speed and overwhelming firepower of modern anti-tank platforms. The bulk of Russian tank forces is the T-72, which has received modernity upgrades alongside its M1 Abrams American counterpart. However, pound for pound, the Abrams continues to outclass the T-72. While most comparisons of the Abrams' capabilities rely on the shocking display of overwhelming superiority against Iraq's T-72s, this is a grossly unfair comparison. For starters, export models of Russian T-72s are not nearly as capable as those fielded by the Russian Army. Secondly, Russian tank crews are overwhelmingly better trained than their Iraqi counterparts in Desert Storm. The Abrams, however, is still the better tank in 2022. With armor, sight, and electronics upgrades integrated into the active tank force on a consistent basis. Russia, on the other hand, has struggled to keep its own tank forces fully modernized. The one advantage that the T-72 enjoys over the Abrams is its ability to fire anti-tank missiles from its barrel, though doing so requires the T-72 to stand still while guiding its missile to target, during which an Abrams could simply scoot out of the way or kill the T-72. Both Russia and the U.S. place a strong emphasis on mechanized infantry, with the U.S. fielding 45,193 armored vehicles versus Russia's 30,122. While this leaves the U.S. better able to replenish losses, Russia still fields enough armored vehicles to provide ample mobility and protection to its infantry. In a battle of attrition, though, the numbers favor the U.S. There is one area, however, where Russia dominates not just the United States, but the entire world, and that's artillery. It's said Russia can field enough artillery that if it all fired at once, you'd feel the explosions on the other side of the world. And the numbers are truly astonishing. Russia absolutely dwarfs the US in numbers of self-propelled artillery, with 6,574 platforms versus America's 1,498. The story remains the same for traditional artillery, with 7,571 howitzers versus the US's 1,339. Russia also enjoys a 3-to-1 advantage in rocket artillery, with 3,391 units versus the US's 1,366. The difference is a product of both geography and priorities. Russia has traditionally had to be concerned with fighting a massive land battle in either Europe against NATO or Asia against China. The nation has also had to contend with the reality that in battle against its greatest competitor, the United States, it could not count on air platforms to provide fire support for frontline troops. Facing off against a technologically superior foe, Russia placed an emphasis on sheer firepower. Superior American Abrams tanks don't matter much if they can't advance due to withering barrages of Russian artillery. The U.S., however, has by necessity shifted most of its fire support capabilities to more mobile airborne platforms. As it faces no threat of invasion or major conflict on its own continent, mobility is more important for the United States military. With a greater focus on technology, mobility, and smart munitions, airborne fire support simply makes more sense to the U.S. military than masses of artillery that need to be transported thousands of miles to any conflict zone. American air-based fire support is far superior even to Russia's masses of artillery on delivering effective fire on target, but only if Russian air defenses can be neutralized. Otherwise, American soldiers might find themselves completely overwhelmed by the world's largest artillery corps. At sea, Russia operates a larger fleet than the United States, with 605 ships versus America's 484. However, the capabilities of America's Navy far surpass those of the Russian Navy, which has historically been the least important of its military branches. Funding priorities reflect this, and today the Russian Navy is in a state of serious decline, operating largely Cold War-era equipment that rarely sees upgrades. The United States currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with its carrier air forces by themselves larger than most nations' entire air fleets. Russia, by comparison, operates only one, and operates is a term we're using rather loosely here, as the Admiral Kuznetsov is infamous for breakdowns. A remnant of the Cold War, the Kuznetsov is in a perpetual state of disrepair and would be incapable of posing even a moderate threat to U.S. forces before it was destroyed. However, America's mighty carrier fleet is its own vulnerability, with Russia having developed hypersonic anti-ship missiles that present a lethal risk to American naval power. Currently, the United States has no defense against these weapons, except to attack and degrade Russian kill chain assets such as radar tracking installations, communication nodes, and satellites. The United States also operates 9 smaller carriers to support amphibious assault operations, while Russia completely lacks this capability. Amphibious operations would likely not play a big role in a U.S.-Russian conflict, but with the ability to fly the F-35, these mini-carriers would only complicate matters for the Russian Air Force and Navy. Russia does outnumber the U.S. in numbers of submarines, with the U.S. operating 68 versus Russia's 70. However, modernity is an issue with Russia's submarine fleet, and it's unknown how many subs Russia can actually put to sea in case of a war, given the state of poor logistics in the Russian Navy. By comparison, the United States submarine fleet is being steadily upgraded with the acquisition of the Virginia-class attack submarine and are on the whole more capable than Russian boats. The United States outnumbers Russia in numbers of destroyers, with 92 guided missile destroyers versus Russia's 15. While outnumbered and outgunned by major combatants, Russia has a far greater fleet of smaller vessels, which could pose a serious threat if massed together or used to harness U.S. supply lines. Russia has also mounted its Caliber cruise missiles on civilian vessels, meaning that any Russian ship could be a potential deadly threat to an unwary American vessel. On the whole, the American military is larger and more capable than the Russian military in 2022. However, Russia has achieved a breakthrough in hypersonic weapons that the U.S. has yet to match, and has even begun to press those weapons into service. This gives Russia a decisive advantage at the opening of any major hostilities, though its weak economy means that the nation can't fully capitalize on this advantage by fielding hypersonic missiles in significant numbers. This is a trend that tracks all across the board, and has repeated itself with the Su-57 fifth-generation fighter and the T-14 Armata tank. Both of these weapon platforms present deadly threats to their U.S. counterparts, but due to a lack of funding, Russia has been forced to postpone any significant purchases for years, if ever. Today, Russia faces a modernity crisis as its legacy forces are being rapidly outclassed technologically by potential rivals. The United States has its own technological problems, however, and over-reliance on technology might become a critical vulnerability for the U.S. military should its satellite or command and control networks be compromised. An addiction to technology by the United States has also led to a legacy of weapons acquisitions in the post-2000s that is, frankly, catastrophic. Funneling billions upon billions into moonshot after moonshot, the United States has failed to bring few of its new weapon systems in the last 20 years to full maturity. The F-35's capabilities are still so in question that both the U.S. Navy and Air Force purchased significant amounts of F-15s and F-18s to compensate for the potential crisis. The Zumwalt destroyer and littoral combat ships were both complete boondoggles that cost billions and left the U.S. Navy high and dry. The failure of the Future Force Warrior program left the U.S. Army with few working technologies and a massive waste of taxpayer money. A focus on technological moonshots has eroded the United States' technological advantage significantly, and today the American military is in desperate need of new weapons platforms that can not just match, but outcompete those being developed or already in service with the armies of China and Russia. Now go check out Can China Defend from a U.S. Invasion? Or click this other video instead.